We had begun discussing the significant event of the Muslims' migration to Abyssinia. We noted that in the 5th year of prophethood, during the month of Rajab, the Prophet Muhammad granted permission to his followers to seek refuge in Abyssinia. This choice was made because Abyssinia allowed them the freedom to worship Allah openly. We explored various lessons and morals derived from this event, especially pertinent for Muslims living as a minority in non-Muslim lands. Shortly after the migration to Abyssinia, however, the Muslims returned to Makkah, with reports suggesting that they came back within 3 months, by the month of Shawwal. The question arises, why did they return so quickly after emigrating? What led them to abandon Abyssinia and return to the very place of their persecution? This brings us to the well-known incident often referred to as the Satanic Verses. It is crucial to examine this event to understand the reasons behind the Sahaba's return. The return of these 14 or 15 individuals, 11 men and 4 women, was precipitated by a single rumor, that the Quraysh had embraced Islam. One can imagine the challenges they faced in Abyssinia, an unfamiliar land with different language, customs, and culture. Given their yearning to return to their homeland, they were quick to believe the rumor, despite its implausibility. Without the means to verify the information, and longing for the familiarity of Makkah, they decided to return, only to discover en route that the rumor was false. It was, in fact, an exaggerated report, not an outright lie. To understand the origin of this rumor, we must analysis into what some have termed the Satanic Verses. The controversy surrounding this incident centers on its authenticity and how it should be interpreted. For simplicity, we will discuss 3 primary versions of the story, though there are more variations. The first version, reported in Sahih al-Bukhari, is the most reliable. It narrates that in the month of Ramadan during the 5th year of prophethood, 2 months after the Muslims' migration, the Prophet Muhammad recited Surah An-Najm in its entirety. This surah is known for its powerful and eloquent verses. At the conclusion of the surah, the final verse commands, "So prostrate to Allah and worship Him." The intensity and eloquence of the Quran during this recitation moved the entire congregation, both Muslims and non-Muslims alike. When the Prophet concluded with the command to prostrate, the emotion in the gathering was so overwhelming that everyone, including the Quraysh, fell into prostration. For the first time, Muslims and non-Muslims united in worship. However, one individual, Al-Walid ibn al-Mughira, in his arrogance, refused to bow down. Instead, he took sand, placed it on his head, and declared, "This is sufficient for me." In another account, it is mentioned that it was either Al-Walid or Umayyah ibn Khalid, both known for their obstinance, who refrained from prostrating. However, this detail, while noteworthy, is not crucial to the essence of the surah. This incident sheds light on the profound impact of the Quran, even upon those who opposed the Prophet. However, the misunderstanding that the Quraysh had embraced Islam likely stemmed from this moment of shared prostration, leading to the premature return of the Muslims from Abyssinia. As the narrative unfolds, it becomes evident that the entire congregation prostrated in unison behind the Prophet Muhammad. By the time rumors had traveled from Mecca to Abyssinia, they had grown exponentially, from mere whispers to substantial claims. The reports had evolved to assert that all had embraced Islam and had united under the leadership of the Prophet Muhammad. This account, although simple in its essence, is a testament to the rapid spread of information and the impact of the Prophet's message. The story of this unified prostration offers profound insights, particularly when we examine into the intricate verses of Surah An-Najm. Regrettably, time constraints prevent us from an exhaustive examination of this powerful surah, which stands as a paragon of eloquence and rhetorical mastery. The final verses, in particular, crescendo with a fervor that leaves even the most hardened listeners in awe. The surah's progression is marked by an escalating intensity, as it poses a series of penetrating questions that challenge the listener to reflect deeply. The sheer power of these verses was such that, as documented by al-Bukhari, even the Quraysh, despite their resistance, were momentarily overwhelmed by the surah's force. Allah Almighty declares, "Has he not been informed of what is in the scriptures of Moses and of Abraham, who fulfilled his obligations? None shall bear the burden of another, and every soul shall be rewarded according to its own deeds. Indeed, to Allah is the ultimate return, for it is He who grants both laughter and tears, life and death, and creates all things in pairs." These verses highlight the omnipotence of Allah, who not only created the world but also promised its eventual recreation. Allah, the Sustainer, grants wealth and contentment, and it is He who governs the mighty Sirius in the heavens. The ancient civilizations of Ad and Thamud were destroyed by Allah's will, as were the people of Noah, known for their gross injustices and defiance. The ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah stand as silent witnesses to divine retribution. In the face of such overwhelming signs, Allah asks, "Which of your Lord's signs do you dispute?" This stern warning, delivered by the Prophet Muhammad, is a continuation of the prophetic tradition, echoing the messages of previous prophets. The day of judgment looms ever nearer, and no one but Allah can reveal its appointed time. Do you then marvel at this recitation, and instead of weeping, do you laugh and jest? While you are heedlessly engrossed in your daily activities, will you not prostrate to Allah and worship Him? The recitation of these final 10 verses, along with their translation, serves to emphasize the profound emotional and spiritual impact of the surah. One can only imagine the effect of the Prophet's full recitation, a stirring performance lasting perhaps 15 to 20 minutes, captivating the audience and leading them to involuntary prostration. Even the Quraysh, known for their staunch opposition, were moved to join in this act of submission. The authenticity of this account, as recorded by al-Bukhari, stands beyond reproach, requiring no embellishment or improbable explanations. It is in this unadulterated form that the story finds its true power, in contrast to later versions that obscure its clarity with unnecessary complications. The narration, as documented in Sahih al-Bukhari, originates from the esteemed companion Ibn Abbas. According to Ibn Abbas, the Prophet Muhammad recited Surah An-Najm, and as he prostrated, all those present, Muslims, polytheists, even the jinn and mankind, prostrated alongside him. The sheer power of the recitation left none who heard it unaffected, even the jinn were moved to prostrate. This version, the first, is authentic and devoid of any reference to Shaitan. There is no need to introduce Shaitan into this narrative. We now turn to the contested versions, versions 2 and 3, which introduce elements not found in the canonical collections of Hadith. These versions are absent from the well-known 6 books of Hadith, from Musnad Ahmad, and even from Ibn Ishaq's and Ibn Hisham's seminal works on the Prophet's biography. Instead, they are found in more obscure compilations and expansive encyclopedic collections, often in sources that aggregate all reports, such as al-Tabari's Tafsir. It is important to understand that al-Tabari did not aim to produce a concise exegesis for the general public. Rather, he intended to compile an encyclopedic work for scholars, meticulously gathering every report he encountered. In the preface to his renowned book, he explicitly states that he intended to document all he had heard, without regard to authenticity. Therefore, the mere inclusion of a report in al-Tabari's work does not guarantee its credibility. It is akin to an unfiltered news source that merely transmits information. Unlike Bukhari, who was a critical collector of hadith, al-Tabari simply compiled everything he came across, regardless of its reliability. As a result, these reports appear in more obscure books and not in the established collections, such as those of al-Bayhaqi or al-Suyuti. One of the most notable Western researchers to study these contested versions was Sir William Muir, a prominent Orientalist and Presbyterian minister who specialized in Islamic studies. Muir, who passed away in 1905, was among the first to label this episode as the Satanic Verses, a term not found in the Quran or Sunnah, nor even in these weaker narrations. It was a title coined by Muir in his extensive writings on the life of the Prophet Muhammad, which were some of the earliest in the English language from a modern scholarly perspective. Islamic sources that do mention this story often refer to it as the narrative of Al-Qarnaiq, a term derived from the name of a bird. The exact identification of this bird remains a subject of debate among modern Arab linguists. Some suggest it is the heron, while others propose it is the pelican or crane. What is clear is that the bird is described as having a long neck, adding a symbolic element to the narrative. Now, let us turn to the 2 versions of this story. Though they share the same core elements, there is a crucial difference that distinguishes them. Version 2, reported by al-Tabari in his Tafsir, traces back to Urwa ibn Az-Zubair, a well-known tabi'i, though not a companion of the Prophet. This is the primary weakness of this report. Urwa did not witness the events firsthand and is not narrating directly from the Prophet, which introduces a significant gap in the chain of transmission. According to Urwa, during the recitation of Surah An-Najm, Allah mentions the names of the three prominent idols worshipped by the Quraysh, Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Manat. The verses in question are found in Surah An-Najm, specifically verses 19 and 20. Have you considered Al-Lat and Al-Uzza? And Manat, the third, the other one. These idols were revered by the Quraysh, who held deeply ingrained cultural biases, particularly regarding gender, as evident in their preferential treatment of males over females. Allah rebukes the Quraysh for their illogical practices, questioning their logic. You would offer your Lord what you yourself discard. The irony is sharp. They bury their daughters alive out of shame, yet attribute daughters to their Lord. The Quranic verse denounces this. What an unjust division. Now, let's analysis into the story and examine some academic details. In Surah An-Najm, verses 19 and 20 state, Have you considered Al-Lat and Al-Uzza? And the third, Manat. According to Urwa ibn az-Zubair, after verse 20, Shaitan intervened, inserting two verses that were not part of the Quran. These verses were heard by the polytheists but not by the Muslims. Shaitan, in his own voice and language, proclaimed, Have you considered Al-Lat and Al-Uzza and the third, Manat? He then added, These are the exalted cranes, or pelicans, whose intercession is to be sought. This addition was the first instance where idols appeared to be praised, suggesting that these revered idols were magnificent birds whose intercession would be accepted by Allah. After hearing these verses, the polytheists believed that the Prophet Muhammad had finally compromised, seemingly accepting their deities. They never objected to Allah's existence. Their dispute lay in the Prophet's rejection of their gods. Thus, they interpreted this as the Prophet's acquiescence to their beliefs, thinking that he had found a middle ground and was now endorsing the worship of these idols alongside Allah. This is the essence of the second version. The term, Al-Qarnaiq, referring to the birds, is used because, according to some interpretations, just as these graceful birds with long necks ascend toward the heavens, the idols were thought to elevate one's prayers to Allah. This metaphorical interpretation emphasizes the perceived sanctity and intercessory power of the idols. This concludes the discussion of version 2. Moving on to the third version, found in sources like Al-Wadi and others, it is crucial to clarify that our religious tradition mandates a rigorous academic approach. The story of the Satanic Verses is not an invention of non-Muslims. It appears in some of our Islamic sources. It must be emphasized this point clearly. Many often confuse Salman Rushdie's novel, which borrows its title from this incident, with the actual historical narrative. Although the book is a work of fiction, the incident it references has become a focal point for critics of Islam. From a non-Muslim perspective, if the story were true, it would suggest that the Quran was subject to change based on the Prophet's whims. According to this narrative, the Prophet Muhammad might have initially accepted the idea of worshipping the idols alongside Allah as a strategic move to appease the Quraysh. However, following backlash from the Muslims, he retracted this, stating that the verses had been inspired not by him, but by Shaitan, hence the term, Satanic Verses. To non-Muslims, this story seemingly indicates that the Prophet, God forbid, was inventing the Quran, adapting it like a political leader who changes his stance according to popular demand. This interpretation has led to the story becoming a significant point of contention and is why it must be addressed with scholarly rigor. It's essential to reiterate that the story exists in Islamic sources and was not fabricated by non-Muslims. Version 3, even more problematic than the second, suggests that the Prophet Muhammad himself heard Shaitan's recitation and mistakenly believed it to be the revelation from Jibreel. He then, according to this version, recited these interpolated verses, Have you considered Al-Lat and Al-Uzza, and the third, Manat? These are the exalted cranes whose intercession is to be sought. The distinction between versions 2 and 3 lies in this critical difference, with the third implying that the Prophet could not differentiate between divine revelation and Shaitan's deception, a claim that is theologically untenable and deeply offensive. This is the central theme of Salman Rushdie's book, which he introduces as a fictional narrative, but the premise revolves around this controversial topic. He titled the book The Satanic Verses, sparking widespread outrage. However, the book and its ensuing controversy are not the focus of our discussion. Our interest lies in the actual story as recorded in early Islamic sources. To maintain academic integrity, it must be noted that this account appears in some early Islamic texts. This is not a fabrication, it is documented in certain historical records. Therefore, we encounter three versions of this story. The first version is recorded in Sahih al-Bukhari, regarded as one of the most reliable collections of hadith. From an Islamic scholarly perspective, this version is the most authentic, akin to the credibility of a top-tier news source. However, as we move to less reliable sources, additional details emerge that diverge from the most trusted accounts. In the second version, it is said that Satan, shouted verses that the mushrik and polytheists heard, but the Muslims did not. The Muslims were thus left puzzled as to why the Quraysh Meccan leaders prostrated. They mistakenly assumed the power of the surah caused their submission. The third version, which is the most troubling, suggests that Shaitan impersonated Gabriel, inserting two verses into the Prophet Muhammad's recitation. According to these accounts, the Prophet was initially unaware of the deception and recited the verses as if they were part of the Quran. After completing the recitation, the Quraysh prostrated. Later, Jibreel reportedly returned to the Prophet, questioning what he had recited. When the Prophet repeated the verses, Jibreel clarified that he had not revealed those verses. Deeply distressed, the Prophet feared that he had unwittingly fabricated these verses. Subsequently, Allah revealed Surah Al-Hajj, verse 52, which according to this interpretation, addresses the incident by affirming that previous prophets and messengers were similarly tested by Shaitan, who sought to influence their recitations. However, Allah would abrogate such satanic influences and affirm His true revelations. This narrative claims that Shaitan momentarily deceived the Prophet Muhammad, who then unknowingly recited these satanic verses. After this realization, Allah corrected the error by revealing the authentic verses, leading the Quraysh, who had initially agreed to a compromise, to renounce their alliance. This development reached the emigrants in Abyssinia, prompting their return. For an academic analysis, it is essential to examine these three versions critically. The first version in Sahih al-Bukhari is undisputedly authentic, appearing in one of the most trusted hadith collections. However, the second and third versions present more challenges. Those who uphold the second and third versions do not find these narratives contradictory to Sahih al-Bukhari's account, as they perceive them as complementary rather than conflicting. Scholars have differed in their assessment of these versions. A significant group of scholars has outrightly rejected versions 2 and 3, adhering strictly to the first version. This group includes notable figures such as Ibn Kathir, a preeminent scholar of tafsir Quranic exegesis, and Al-Qarnaiq, an expert in Sirah prophetic biography, and a well-known scholar Fakhr al-Din al-Razi. Consequently, many authoritative scholars consider the first version alone as sufficient and reliable. One of the most renowned scholars of the past, Muhammad Ishaq ibn Khuzaymah, was a distinguished hadith scholar who passed away in 311 AH. He is among the select few who authored an authentic hadith collection. To briefly digress, there are 4 scholars recognized for compiling Sahih works: Bukhari, Muslim, Ibn Hibban, and Ibn Khuzaymah. Thus, Ibn Khuzaymah stands among the great luminaries of hadith scholarship. When questioned about the incident where Shaitan purportedly inspired the Prophet, Ibn Khuzaymah dismissed it as a fabrication. He asserted that this narrative was concocted by the enemies of Islam to undermine the religion. This stance dates back to the early centuries of Islam, specifically around 311 AH, indicating that from the outset, some scholars viewed this account as a deliberate falsification aimed at discrediting Islam. This represents the perspective of one group of scholars, and it would have been preferable if this view was universally accepted. However, there are other scholars of significant repute who have endorsed alternative versions of the story, which necessitates an academic and impartial examination. Our religion demands honesty and transparency, urging us to confront the truth, no matter how complex or contentious. Therefore, we must approach this topic with academic rigor. Notably, in 1966, a global conference was convened in Cairo to address this very story. The entire conference was dedicated to scrutinizing this narrative from an academic standpoint, with numerous scholars presenting papers and engaging in discussions. This gathering, attended by many prominent scholars, concluded that the story was indeed fabricated and lacked historical veracity. Consequently, the majority of contemporary scholars reject the second and third versions of the story, deeming them unnecessary. This conclusion is reflected in most modern seerah literature, where the story is either omitted or explicitly labeled as a fabrication. Nevertheless, academic honesty compels us to acknowledge that this is not the sole position within Sunni Islam. Some scholars have accepted the second and even the third versions of the story. These are not minor figures, they are among the most esteemed scholars. The second version, which suggests that Iblis spoke aloud without the Prophet's knowledge, is somewhat more palatable, as it does not involve any direct action by the Prophet. In this narrative, Iblis simply used his own voice to deceive the people. This version has been accepted by numerous scholars, most notably Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, a preeminent hadith scholar. Ibn Hajar, recognized as the foremost authority on Sahih al-Bukhari, argued that while each individual report of the story might not be supported by a robust chain of transmission, when considered collectively, these weak reports offer corroborative evidence, rendering the story credible. This leads us to a brief discussion on the principles of hadith science. When multiple weak chains of transmission narrate the same event, scholars often combine these chains to establish a reliable report. This principle is applied by scholars like Ibn Hajar to validate the second version of the story. He asserted that although each report individually is weak, their cumulative effect lends authenticity to the account. The third version of the story, which posits that Shaitan successfully deceived the Prophet into reciting verses, would have been easier to dismiss if not for the endorsement of one of Islam's greatest scholars, Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah discussed it extensively in several of his works on tafsir, Quranic exegesis. Ibn Taymiyyah argued that not only do the reports collectively authenticate the narrative, but that the verse from Surah Al-Hajj provides unequivocal evidence supporting the occurrence. Some of you familiar with the Arabic language might point out that tamana generally means to wish. However, a more nuanced understanding reveals that the term originally signified to recite. This meaning is well documented in pre-Islamic poetry, such as in the Mu'allaqat, where tamana is used to denote recitation. Even some of the Sahaba, including Ibn Abbas, interpreted tamana as to recite. Over time, the word evolved, and one of its later meanings became to wish. This adds another layer of complexity to our discussion, opening a window into the intricate field of Islamic studies, which often requires deep linguistic and historical analysis. Thus, the verse in question can be interpreted in two ways. One interpretation of the phrase, tamana, in the context of the verse suggests that when the Prophet recited, Shaitan attempted to introduce something into his recitation. Allah, however, abrogated what Shaitan inserted and reinforced the clarity of his verses. The verse continues to explain that this event served as a test for those with diseased hearts or hardened dispositions, as they would be led astray by Shaitan's intrusion. Ibn Taymiyyah asserts that this interpretation is clear and directly linked to the incident involving the Satanic Verses. The alternate school of thought, however, argues that this verse has no connection to the Satanic Verses and should be understood in its general sense. According to this view, the verse simply means that no prophet or messenger has ever made a wish or intention without Shaitan attempting to interfere, trying to corrupt the prophet's intentions. Yet, Allah purifies the prophet's intentions, eliminating any influence of Shaitan, thereby solidifying his revelations. Ibn Taymiyyah responds to this interpretation by questioning how they explain the subsequent verse, which mentions that what Shaitan introduced becomes a trial for those with diseased hearts. According to Ibn Taymiyyah, this indicates that something external was indeed heard, not just an internal thought in the Prophet's mind, which would serve as a fitna trial for the people. We must also explore a theological dimension that complicates the acceptance of versions 2 and 3 of the story. The majority of scholars who reject these versions do so because they fundamentally challenge the theological concept of infallibility of the prophets. They argue that accepting such narratives implies that Shaitan could deceive the prophet, blurring the line between divine revelation and satanic intervention. This, they contend, undermines the integrity of the revelation itself, suggesting that it could be corrupted or tampered with, which is theologically unacceptable. One modern scholar vehemently rejects these versions, stating that, regardless of the apparent strength of the chains of transmission, he cannot accept any narrative that compromises the sanctity of prophetic revelation. This sentiment echoes the views of earlier scholars, such as Al-Qarnaiq, author of the seminal work, Ash-Shifa, which explores the rights and virtues of the Prophet. In his work, Al-Qarnaiq strongly condemns the notion that the Prophet could have been influenced by Shaitan, using both logical and emotional arguments to defend the Prophet's honor. Al-Qarnaiq and others assert that the prophets are protected from errors, ma'asum, a theological principle that maintains they are divinely safeguarded from sin and major mistakes. Thus, they reject any incident that implies otherwise. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, a leading hadith scholar, takes a more nuanced stance. He argues that the second version of the story does not compromise the Prophet's infallibility, because it attributes the recitation to Shaitan, not the Prophet. Therefore, Ibn Hajar dismisses the third version but accepts the second, as it does not implicate the Prophet directly in any error. Ibn Taymiyyah's perspective on Isma, while in agreement with the general Sunni consensus, differs in its application. He affirms that prophets are protected from major sins, vulgar acts, and falsehoods, but he allows for the possibility of minor, non-intentional errors. This nuanced interpretation has sparked theological debate among scholars regarding the nature and extent of prophetic infallibility. Ibn Taymiyyah argues that while prophets might make errors in judgment, such errors are not sins but rather mistakes in decision-making. He supports this claim with various examples from the Sirah, the most prominent being the incident with the prisoners of the Battle of Badr. In this instance, the Prophet made a decision regarding the captives, which Allah later corrected through revelation, stating, "It is not fitting for a prophet to take prisoners of war until he has fully subdued the land." Quran 8:67. Allah, in His wisdom, chose to overlook the decision, indicating it was not the most optimal choice. This instance, Ibn Taymiyyah contends, illustrates a judgmental error, not a moral failing. Furthermore, Ibn Taymiyyah presents a view that prophets may commit minor sins. However, two crucial points accompany this. First, prophets do not persist in these sins, and second, they immediately repent. The prime example of this is the story of Adam, who, despite being a prophet, succumbed to temptation and ate from the forbidden tree. The Quran explicitly states, "And Adam disobeyed his Lord and erred." Quran 20:121. Yet, Adam's status as a prophet remains indisputable, as the consensus among scholars affirms the infallibility of all prophets. Ibn Taymiyyah also references Surah Al-Fath, verse 2, where Allah promises to forgive the Prophet Muhammad's past and future shortcomings, indicating that even the best of creation may err, though these are minor and do not detract from their prophetic mission. He asserts that the Prophet Muhammad, while the most exemplary of humans, was indeed human and capable of minor mistakes. However, these errors do not diminish his status. Rather, his prompt repentance and Allah's subsequent forgiveness exemplify his role as a true model for humanity. If prophets were like angels, Ibn Taymiyyah argues, they would cease to be relatable role models for their followers. Regarding the so-called Satanic Verses, that the term itself does not originate from Islamic sources. To aid understanding, it refers to it as the incident of Al-Qarnaiq. As Ibn Taymiyyah argues that this incident does not imply that the divine revelation was corrupted, on the contrary, it underscores the protection of revelation. The Prophet's transparency in recounting an event that might have reflected negatively on him only further attests to his unparalleled truthfulness. He chose to disclose this incident despite its potential to harm his reputation, highlighting his commitment to the truth. Ibn Taymiyyah further cites a hadith from Aisha found in Sahih Bukhari, which he suggests we will examine in greater depth later. He emphasizes that some narratives within the Sirah are sensitive, controversial, and emotionally charged. Two such stories require careful and calm analysis: the incident of the Satanic Verses and the account of Zainab bint Jahsh. These stories have often been exploited by non-Muslim critics, necessitating an academic approach to address them properly. The story of Zainab, which will be discussed in detail later, involves her marriage to Zayd ibn Haritha, the adopted son of the Prophet. The Quran addresses the Prophet's initial reluctance to advise Zayd to divorce Zainab, fearing the reaction of the people, while he should have been more concerned about Allah's command. This story, while challenging, is easier to resolve through scholarly discussion, though it still presents its own set of difficulties. In navigating these narratives, particularly in a context where Islam is frequently scrutinized and misunderstood, it is imperative to confront the truth with knowledge and clarity. Ignorance is not a defense. Instead, understanding and knowledge provide the power to address and dispel misconceptions. It is crucial to both acknowledge and critically examine these historical accounts. When addressing complex and sensitive issues, a rigorous engagement with the material is necessary. At present, accepting the initial premise at face value, namely, that the Prophet Muhammad should have prioritized his fear of Allah over public opinion, as stated in the Quran, is appropriate. Aisha's hadith exemplifies this point, asserting that if the Prophet had wished to conceal any part of the revelation, he would have hidden this verse. However, he chose to openly recite it, and it remains a part of the Quran to this day. This transparency, according to Aisha, demonstrates the Prophet's commitment to truth, despite potential negative perceptions. Allah is aware of the ultimate truth. The first version of the incident is deemed preferable, while the second and third versions are less convincing for several reasons. The integrity of revelation. The idea that Shaitan could influence the Prophet's revelations, despite Ibn Taymiyyah's explanations, appears to undermine the purity of divine revelation. Allah has guaranteed the protection of His words, as evidenced by numerous verses affirming that no one can corrupt the Quran. Authenticity of narratives. No authentic hadith supports the Satanic Verses incident. All reported narratives on this subject are weak and lack an unbroken chain of transmission back to the Prophet Muhammad. This includes even the most robust narrations, which have proven unreliable. Historical interpretation. Historical theological texts suggest that claims of fabricated revelations are largely unfounded. Although attempts have been made to distort the Quran, they have never succeeded in altering its integrity.